let's get started here. We've got 25 right now participants. May have one or two more joining. Welcome everybody. My name is Suresh Srinivasan. I coordinate the beginner special interest group for the Minnesota Astronomical Society. During the summers, we meet at Metcalf Field, which is part of the Bellwin Conservancy, and it's located near Afton, and we do some observing. So people bring their telescopes, and we look at planets, the moon, deep sky objects, answer people's questions, help them set up their own telescopes, and learn the sky. And during the fall and winter, when it's too cold out, we do presentations. And so we've got a nice lineup coming up here this fall and winter. And leading off that is this presentation by Dave Tosteson called Off the Deep End. I've been trying to get with Dave for a few years to do a presentation. He's one of our foremost visual observers in the club. He's a physician by trade, and I believe he retired last July. So congratulations on your retirement, Dave. And just a little spiel on him. He's been interested in space and science since childhood. And around 1985, which is around the same time I got into astronomy, Dave attended a MAS star party at Baylor, and that really got him started. He started with binoculars and worked his way up to a 10-inch telescope, and then to an 18, then a 25. And in 2005, he bought a 32-inch telescope. And I think between the 25 and 32, that's largely what he uses to this day. And Dave is one of those guys that likes to look at the really, really hard stuff. He isn't really all that excited about the nice, easy, bright stuff. He goes for things that virtually no one else is looking for. And it's really interesting. I have a little bit of that background too, but not nearly to what Dave does. And he's been able to write about it in periodicals such as Sky and Telescope, Amateur Astronomy, and the Reflector magazines. So he's somewhat of an authority now on these obscure yet really interesting objects. So I'm going to let Dave take it over here. Dave, go ahead and hit on share screen. In your presentation.
You see that?
Yeah, we can hear you too. Now, right before Dave gets started, just one quick point, everybody. Please turn off your video, your cameras to save bandwidth, and also mute yourselves. You can do that at the bottom left ribbon in Zoom. And then if you have a question, just click on chat. A box should open up on your screen, and then just drop your question in there. And every few minutes or so, I'm gonna stop Dave to ask your question, just to keep the rhythm. And yeah, so feel free to ask any questions you'd like during the talk, via the chat feature, or at the end when we have a Q&A session. All right, Dave, take it away.
Well, Suresh, thank you very much for that fine introduction. I feel honored to talk to the group. And like he said, we're gonna go along here. And my feeling is we'd start, I don't know all the skills of the people who are watching, so we'll kind of start with some of the basics and work our way towards some of the more advanced concepts. And please feel free to ask questions as we go, and then we'll have a general question and answer at the end. So just a little bit about me. Suresh did a nice job, but I've been interested in space things since I can remember. Reading books, I have about 1,500 comic books from the early 60s. I've always been fascinated with space, of course. Star Trek was the big one, and learning the sky in 1979, I took a class at the University of Minnesota from Carlos Kaufmanis, who some of you might recognize the name. He used to do the Christmas Star of Bethlehem lecture, and left Minnesota in the 90s, but did that thousands of times around the Minneapolis, St. Paul, and other areas too. In 1985, well, let's go forward a little bit. In 1985, I was about 6 years after I took that class. I was finishing my training, and I thought, well, I'm going to just take a look at this. I looked at some magazines, and I went out to Baylor at the time, and a friend or a person there had a 10-inch telescope and showed me M13, and I was just about, my jaw dropped open. I go, that, you can't see that. And then Lauren Nelson was there. You all know Lauren Nelson. and he was popping off different globular clusters in Sagittarius from the top of his head. And I going, how can people do this? It's just, they just know where things are in the sky. So learning the sky is a really important part of the education. So I asked Suresh if he knew the one on the right, and I'll let you guys think about that. I'll cogitate a little bit. I bet most of you, if not all of you, have binoculars. If there's any people who are wondering if they're interested in astronomy and not really gotten into the hobby yet, you can use binoculars for many things, besides astronomy. So I started out with binoculars for about a year, and I actually took them down to Puerto Vallarta, Mexico, during the winter and see all sorts of things you couldn't see from Minnesota. And I was just hooked. And then I had to come back, and that's when I looked through the telescope and had to get a telescope. So how do you learn the skies? Well, there's many, many guides out there. And of course, there's many things on the internet, but it's nice to have something in your hand that's not a computer-based thing. And this Peterson Field Guide to the Stars and Planets is how I started. And even 35 or 40 years later, it's still, it's got all the constellations in it. It's got most of the major deep sky objects. It's got the star names. It's got a lot of little trivia in it. It's got maps of where things are during the different seasons. So that's a nice thing to have when you're starting out. A dark sky, to be, obvious about it, is one of the most important things you can have. I live about 40 minutes northeast of St. Paul, so I've seen, I like to tell people I've seen 20th magnitude things from my driveway. It's not as dark as the Texas Star Party, but it can be very dark out here. Southerly skies, if you ever get a chance, southern United States, or certainly Australia, New Zealand, and South America are, and now Africa are places to go. I've been there a couple of times, and I'd certainly like to spend more time down there. You guys may know the name Jim Fox. Jim Fox was the person who started the 3M Astronomy Club back in about 1973, and he helped start the Minnesota Astronomical Society after that. When I joined the MAS in 1985, he was involved. In fact, he had an event at his home in Afton, and he was building an observatory for I think an 8 or 9 inch refractor at the time. So he was selling his 10-inch Dob, and I said, I'll buy that. So I bought that for $300, and I still have it in my driveway, and I'm fixing it up to give to a neighbor whose son is interested in it, because I haven't used that for a long time. But then once you get a telescope, what do you do? How do you use it, or how do you use the binoculars? Well, a chaise lounger and a good red flashlight, and there's different binocular guides besides the field guide. I have one by my desk here, several books on binoculars that are really great, and it's kind of fun to learn the sky, learn the constellations. I did the Constellation Hunter, or stars for the Astronomical League, and you think, well, that's pretty simple, but you'd be surprised at what parts of certain constellations you didn't know that they went there, and you didn't know what stars. So it's kind of fun to do that, to learn the sky so you can work your way around. Some of you have probably seen the laser pointers. You got to be careful with any kind of aircraft or satellites or things like that out there. But if you're careful not to use them in the wrong way, they're very helpful to show other people what you're looking at, different parts of the sky and stars. I did this the other night with some friends who came over. So what do you need? Well, the best telescope, once you get beyond binocular, is the one you use the most. I have, I don't know, about 15 telescopes from, about I've got a 66 millimeter refractor that I use for my eclipse travels, just 2.5 inch refractor that's goes on a tripod, and it's very simple, but it's very good, and all the way up to the 32 inch. So the ones that you use the most are the ones that you're going to enjoy. Portability is important depending on what you're doing. I do actually take my 32 inch and my 25 inch to about 30 different regional star parties down in Texas and Oklahoma. And it's a lot of work to load up the trailer with every equipment, but to take advantage of the really, really great skies, that's portability, I think, is important. Some of you have observatories where the equipment isn't portable, but to have a portable scope as well is important. A stable scope is very it's essential. You can't use something that's inexpensive on a tripod that wiggles and you will never find anything. And so resist the temptation to buy, very inexpensive wobbly tripod type of refractor. Yeah, the quality stuff you'll not only use for a long time, maybe your lifetime, but with used equipment sites like Astromart and eBay, the value of some of these things not only maintains, but it actually can go up over time. So what do you need on your telescope? Well, you need a finder scope because you got to get there somehow. You can, I have different types of zero magnification finders to small refractors to different, even the laser pointed I have mounted on my 32 inch. We'll go over that in a minute. In fact, let's just show you. This is not my telescope, but it's the closest I could come here. It's the old Coulter 10-inch Odyssey, which is looks very similar with the closed sonotube and the plywood to what I have, and I'm restoring it right now for my neighbor's son. The finder scopes I use, maybe you know about the right angle correct. I like that because it's easier on my neck than looking up the side of the tube. Plus, it's a correct image. It looks like the sky. The nice thing about the Orion finder is that it doesn't have two sets of 3 screws. It's got a sleeve that it goes in, and then there's one set of 3 things on the end, 2 of which are mounted at 90-degree angles to screw, and the other is a spring in between. So really you're doing right, left, up, and down, and it's much easier than having 6 screws to I've got a picture of it. See on the bottom there of the one on the left is the spring, and then the top up and down is here on top. You can't see the other ones 90 degrees around the back, but it takes a couple seconds to align it. For my 32 inch, I use a Star Blast, take it out of its housing there, and I made some rings and some things to align it. And I use a 4.5 inch for my 32 as a finder. Works really well. Let's go back. Talked about the laser. So focusers, there's really 2 kinds of focusers. There's more than 2, but 2 main kind of focusers, the rack and pinion type of focuser and the 1.25 inch for most smaller scopes and smaller eyepieces. It weighs less for one thing, and for about 6 inches of a reflector. Now, if you have a expensive refractor, all of them on the end almost always have 2, or some of them even have 3 inch for cameras, focusers. But the 1.25 inch for most lesser expensive eyepieces work pretty well. Once you get up to 8 inches or higher, you probably want a larger focuser because the quality of the eyepieces improve and you get a better view. All of the 2-inch ones, of course, have a 1.25 inch adapter, and they almost now all have what's called a compression ring adapter, so that there's no screw marks that mar up the side of the eyepieces. It also centers the eyepiece. Now, if you're just getting your telescope set up, this is a talk in and of itself, how to collimate and get the focuser lined up. But we can't get into all that today. But if you don't know how to do that, you have to really do that with a reflector every time you use it. Refractors, unless you drop them, will stay collimated. So an experienced observer can show you, and then there's quite a bit of information out there, and there's sets of tools that you can use to collimate. But you really need to do that at the start of every night, and then sometimes even if it's a long night, in the middle of the night, to tune it up. These are the 2 different kinds of focusers we're talking about. The one on the left is fairly inexpensive. I just bought a new one for my Star Blast because the teeth inside there had worn down, and so the whole thing was like $15. So they're very inexpensive, mostly plastic, a little bit of metal. But the one on the right is $500. So it's a 10-to-1 reduction with the gold knob, so you can get very fine focusing, and then they have locking screws on them. for different things. But on my more expensive, larger telescopes, I use the better focusers. Now, probably a lot of you have looked at filters, and there are a lot of filters out there, but I think I really just use 3 filters, basically. If you have a Dobsonian, you can use you can use filter slides for different telescopes, but on my Dobsonian telescopes, I have the balsa wood filter slide from Astrochrome. Very lightweight, doesn't affect the the balance of the tube, and it just attaches to the inside between the focuser and the secondary. The filter slides are all 2-inch, and then you don't, if you have 2-inch filters, you don't need to have both a 1 1/4 and a 2-inch filter, which of course saves on money. You can quickly change between filters. You can change between 1 filter and no filters. And I just think they're invaluable, especially for things like planetary nebula. But there's a lot of bright nebula too that can benefit from filter, like the Veil, supernova remnant, and of course specialty things like the Horsehead, which I was looking at in October from Oklahoma. So which ones do you use? Well, the oxygen 3 is the most useful one. It can be used for planetary nebula. It's almost essential for some very faint planetary nebula. And then it darkens the field, and the nebula stays bright, so it basically pops out of the field. And then the central star in the middle, of course, is filtered out, so you can kind of see if you can see the central star by going back and forth between the filter and the no filter. The California nebula will, and the Horsehead will respond to something called the H beta. And then the UHC filter is a broader filter. It doesn't have the narrow emission lines. And so it's used as kind of a light reduction filter in more light polluted areas. I don't use that as much because I tend to observe from darker areas. There are specialized filters. There's one I bought not too long ago that I just use on things called Bohrwarps, which are the quasar ionization echoes, where a quasar is shut off, but the ionization that it caused in an extragalactic nebula is still glowing, where the galaxy itself and the quasar are not glowing. It's very interesting. There's a picture of a Astrochrome filter slide on an ultralight, I think it's an Obsession. And this one's got a heating dew system that curls along in between them. The finger hole on the left is where you pull. The large hole on the right is the open area without a filter, and then the 3 different filters you can slide back and forth just within a couple seconds. Now,
hey, Dave, let me stop right here.
Sure.
I don't see any questions in the chat. Does anybody have a question that they'd like to ask so far? I don't see anything. So go ahead, Dave.
Okay. Now this is, again, a whole talk or many talks in and of itself. And if you go on some of the chat rooms, like Cloudy Nights especially, every time a new eyepiece comes out, people try it and they give their recommendations and their opinions and stuff. And it's really one of the fun parts about astronomy is comparing the views through different eyepieces. At star parties, if there's 10, 15, 20 or more telescopes out there and you're interested, just walk around and ask people a question. I have a friend, I don't know if he's on the talk today, Tim Parson, he could talk for hours just on eyepieces, and he will talk for hours. And we used to kid that he had, he works at a plastic product company and he gets these big cases basically for free. And he had filled up a couple of these big cases. He must have had, 60 eyepieces, 70, I don't know. He sold them in recent years as he realizes he doesn't use all of them that often, but we like to joke about that. But look through a lot of eyepieces, narrow field, wide field, the different quality, how much coma or distortion there is toward the edge. Obviously, with the less expensive eyepieces, you're going to have a little bit more distortion. Most of them will be very good in the middle. If you think about the wide field eyepieces, it's the difference between looking through a paper towel tube for the narrowest ones that are about 30 degrees and looking through a funnel at 110, or even there's one that's 120 degrees field of view. You have to get your eyeball up and you're kind of looking out into space. But they can be expensive. So my recommendation is probably to buy a few, two, maybe three very good ones, because they can be hundreds of dollars a piece. But I have eyepieces that I've had since the 80s. So if you take care of them well, they will last basically your whole career. You can find discounts, usually 20% or so, maybe even up to 30% on Astromart. Um, and then when I do my observing, I have a vest, a black vest, and with a hood on it, and it's got four big pockets. So one is with my recorder, and the other three would be for eyepieces. So I usually put two, maybe three eyepieces in there. But almost all of my observing, I'd say 90% of my observing is done with two or three eyepieces. But I own about 25 because there are certain specialty eyepieces, like it says on the bottom, that are real ultra wide for big nebulas that give these fabulous views, especially if you're sharing with other people at star parties. But they're just beautiful to look at if you want to take a break. And then the high transmission, narrower ones that have less glass, high quality glass, like the Zeiss Abbey Ortho, which is probably my most expensive eyepiece, 6 millimeter. And that one I think I paid $600 for, and now they're probably $800 or $900. It's a lot of money for a little bit of glass, but if you go between different eyepieces, you can tell the difference. That you can sometimes see something that you can't see in other eyepieces. So for me, that was worth it.
Hey, Dave, we do have one question.
Go ahead.
Amina asks, since you suggested to get a guide on binoculars, is there a type of binocular that you'd recommend?
So the question, as I heard it, is what type of binocular is the best?
Yes, would you recommend?
Okay. So there's a couple parts of that question. When you're looking for astronomy, the larger the aperture, the second number, the 10 by 50, 12 by 60, the second number means you're gathering more light. It's in millimeters. The first number, of course, is magnification. If you get up beyond about a 10 by 50 binocular, it's pretty hard to hold it steady with your hands, even if you're laying back on a chaise lounger, and your hands can get tired. So the smaller binoculars, of course, are adequate for nature when it's light out during the day, like birds and other things, wildlife. So 8 by 42 is sort of a sweet spot between what you can use during the day and what can be useful at night. I just bought a pair of binoculars at National Camera, not very expensive, I think $150 or $200. But then the guy was showing me the $3,000 binocular that was the same size, the Swarovski. And I took him outside and I looked, and yeah, of course it's clear, it's better, it's less comb at the edge. But is it worth paying, 20 times as much? For me, the answer is no. If you're a birder that goes all over the world, the answer might be yes. It's just like me spending, hundreds of dollars on a single eyepiece. So as far as buying a binoculars, I would say buy one that you can use in the day and the night. One comment I have is that I have a pair of small Canon image stabilized binoculars. And basically there's a battery inside with a system. When you hit a button, it takes the shakes away. So if your hands jiggle a little bit, which we all do, if it's not on a mount, it's amazing. I mean, if you've never looked through one of them, you just almost can't believe it. And mine is only 8 by 25, but it can perform as well as a 42 millimeter binocular or a 10 power binocular. And so that's one I take on some of my trips for nature and stuff.
And then Dave, Ron Schmidt has a question for you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Do you have a favorite eyepiece brand?
Well, I guess I have a lot of Teleview eyepieces. I probably have 13 or 10 or 12, 13, Nagler Teleview eyepieces. I like those. I only have one Ethos, which is their ultra wide 100 millimeter. And then I have some Explorer Scientific. The Ethos is a 6 millimeter. The Explorer Scientific is the 9 and the 14 and the 20 millimeter, which I got at a discount about 8 or 9 years ago. All three of them were reasonably priced. Now they've gone way up. So I like those for big wide things. The Zeiss are probably the best out there, and some people would disagree, but again, they're expensive. I know a set of Zeiss, all 5 of them with a Barlow, are $4,000 or $5,000, which is crazy amount of money. But I think the Teleview eyepieces are, to my mind, probably the best. There's a lot of glass, and if you're looking at planets through a refractor, like a 4 or 5, even 6-inch refractor, then some of these ortho type eyepieces that have a lot less glass will have higher transmission, and you see some of the very faint, subtle colors and structures more. But for deep sky observing, which is kind of what the talk is about, I would say the Teleview ones, you can't really beat them. Any other questions?
No, that's the only ones we have so far. Feel free to chime in with questions on the chat.
Sure. Okay, we'll go on. So what do you look at? What is out there to observe? This is, the fun part. It's kind of like, you get a new car, you look at the stereo and you look at all the buttons and the computers and this and that, but you go, well, we're going to drive somewhere. So where do you go? What do you look at? And this is really the fun part, because if you talk to 5 or 10 different people, you're going to get different opinions about what is interesting. And this is where the star parties, where there's many people to talk to and many things to look at are invaluable. The moon and the sun are going to be out there all the time. Of course, with the sun, you need a special filter. You got to be very careful about having a correct filter. But the moon, binoculars, there's almost no other thing that'll show them like binoculars. But if you want to look at craters and different features on the moon, a small, 3 or 4 inch telescope will show you just wonderful things. Planets, the moons of the planets can be great. The Astronomical League, which is, most everybody I think belongs to if they join the club, has a series of about 50 different observing programs for every conceivable thing, including radio astronomy. So all the things that are listed on the slide here basically have programs. Plus, a lot of these things have individual books. I have a book on planetary nebula. I have several books on different kinds of galaxies and groups of galaxies. And then the internet has a lot of information about specific objects. Something called the NGC-IC project, which is researched over many, many years, which has things. I just completed something called the Herschel list, the full 2400 Herschel list I've been working on for, off and on for about 20 years. I just completed it this summer. So there's an endless number of things you can look at. Way down on the bottom, I wrote something called exotics, which are, how do I say this? Brown dwarfs, gravitationally lensed arcs, different things like that I've seen, that I've written about. And, this is really hard because sometimes you can look for many years, many times in different places, different telescopes, and not see it. I suppose it would be like going out, to a trip and looking for a specific individual rare type of bird until you finally see it after many tries. So I like to search the internet. I like to search actually Astrophysical Journal and the other astronomy journals, Astronomical Journal and the monthly notices from England, and Astronomy and Astrophysics from Europe, and even some other ones to look for things. It's getting harder to find things because most things are in different wavelengths other than visual now. But once in a while, I'll find something fun to look at that I can maybe share and write about. Everybody knows about most of this stuff: sky and telescope astronomy, the reflector, which you all get, amateur astronomy, which some of you might not be as familiar with, is all written by amateurs. Charlie Warren is the editor. He's done a great job for the last 10 years. The guy before him who started the magazine, Tom Clark, made my 15 and 25-inch Tektron telescopes with the galaxy mirrors that I've had for one of them for over 30 years. Charting, a lot of things are on computer now, on your phone, on your iPad. next to the computer, but I still think it's important to have a paper chart in case something goes wrong. And Wilman Bell, that went out of business a year ago, is now back in business, bought out by the American Astronomical Association, who bought all of their books and their information. So they have something called Uranometria, which used to be in 2 volumes, North and South, but a couple of years ago they made 1 volume. And I have a little music stand out there by my telescope, and I just have that out there, and it's just wonderful to have the whole sky. Stars down to 9.5 magnitude. When I look at fader things, when I need a computer chart, I make a chart with finder charts and all the way different kind of eyepiece magnifications, usually a picture from the Digital Sky Survey and our journal article or a website article, all inside of a little plastic, 3-ring thing that I can take to the eyepiece when just the paper part, and have it right at the eyepiece to help me find things. Because if you're navigating in 18th, 19th magnitude objects, you need stars that are very faint. The night for beginners, the Night Sky Observer's Guide is probably the single best paper resource. This came out of magazines from the 1980s from Glenn Sanner and Bob Keppel, and they had every other month they had a constellation, and over the years they basically did all the constellations in the north. They had some help with some people from the south, and so they eventually were published by Wilman Bell and put those observations together, and they cut it off at 14th magnitude because they figured that's where a 15, maybe an 18-inch telescope can show detail. Anything beyond that, and it's not, almost just a small dot of light. But with the Southern Sky now, there's three volumes, and then Bob Keppel himself did a lot of imaging, went into imaging later on. He's 80 now, but he did imaging, and then he did a volume a couple years ago on the Milky Way. And so there's actually 4 volumes for the whole series, and they're just fabulous. There are many specialty books. I've got, I don't know how many astronomy books, more than I'd want to admit. And it's fun to go through them and just look through it. I have one of the original copies of ARP's Atlas from 1966. It was given to me as a gift by a friend. One of the things I treasure. I have other original photographs. I don't take them outside. I make a copy of them and take the copy outside. There's websites for major observatories. Of course, the Hubble and now the Webb telescope will have their websites, no pun intended. And then comets are on the internet. There's Supernova page by Dave Green in England, who's, has all the different supernova when they occur. Even now there's, we were in Wyoming for the eclipse, total eclipse 4 years ago at the Astronomical League convention. And the neutron star binary merger event occurred 4 days before the eclipse. And we were all out there, but they kept it a secret. And it got up to 18.8 magnitude visually, called a kilonova. And we could have seen that in the telescopes that they had out there if it had been made public. And in the last 4 years, to my knowledge, there hasn't been one as bright. But these astronomical lists, I'm going to put a little plug in for Jerry Jones in January is doing, I think, the next talk. And he's going to talk all about the observing list. He's the Minnesota Astronomical League Society's observing coordinator. And I've been keeping him busy now that I retired. I've had these things done. I just haven't had them ready to turn in good looking form. And so I think I've done 5 of them in the last month. So I'm keeping Jerry busy.
So Dave, we've got a couple of questions.
Yeah, go ahead.
Steve Schmidt's asking, can you visually observe gravitational lensing artifacts from amateur telescopes?
Well, that's a really, really good question. And I might refer you guys to the article I wrote for the Reflector in December of 2019, 2 years ago, on gravitational lenses. So that's got many different things in there, but I'll just answer the question here for the audience. The answer is yes. You can see there's different kinds of gravitational lensing. And the most common one is where, the intervening, it's usually a galaxy, a massive elliptical galaxy will split something behind it, which is almost always a quasar, into two parts. And if it's just in the right, almost directly lined up, you can split it into 3 or 4 parts, sometimes even more. In a perfect alignment, which never happens really, but there are some near perfect alignment, there are things called Einstein rings. And then sometimes if there's a group of galaxies that will take another galaxy, it's not a quasar, so it's not a point of light, but it's an extended amount of light, and it'll string out the light into an arc called a gravitationally lensed arc. And in 2008, I think I was the first one to see one of these. I spent 90 minutes at the top of my ladder from the Okie-Tex Star Party looking for this one night. And I finally found it after 10 years of trying. And in October at the Okie-Tex, we rented a house near Okie-Tex. I had a 25-inch down there, and I found another gravitational lensed arc, and a couple other people confirmed that too. So the answer is yes. It's very difficult, and that's one of those things, like a rare bird. You have to be in the right place at the right time, but you have to have a lot of planning. And what I found is the Palomar Observatory Sky Survey second edition in the 1990s goes down to about 21st magnitude. And my rule of thumb is if I can see it on there, I'll probably be able to see it in perfect conditions in my 32-inch telescope.
Dave, the next question is from Brandon Hamill. He's asking about breathing. Do you use any different types of breathing techniques when observing? I have read that Stephen James O'Meara does oxygen loading when going deep.
Well, I suppose if you think about it from a medical standpoint, there's something, called O2 saturation, oxygen saturation, little things on your finger, your ear. And normally it's in the high 90s. But what happens when you're observing is you tend to hold your breath. And when you hold your breath, if you had one on your finger, you'd see within so many seconds it would start going down. And so it's not that you have to hyperventilate to get the oxygen up. It's more that, you don't want to hold your breath too long to let the oxygen go down, if that makes sense. I have a little technique where I will, have my head turned a little bit, so my eye I'm observing with is to the eyepiece, and then my mouth is off to the side, and I breathe out, out of the side of my mouth that's away from the eyepiece, so it's actually kind of shooting up. It's though you're trying not to blow smoke in somebody's face if you're smoking a pipe or a cigarette or something. And so the heat, of course, goes up and away from the eyepiece. And if you do it wrong, if you breathe on the eyepiece, you'll see that it fogs it up right away. That's a good question. Any other questions?
Sorry, I muted myself. Yeah, there is one more question from Ron Schmidt. Dave, do you ever do nightly supernova searches a la Robert Evans?
That's a good question too. So back in the 80s, I was very interested in this. And Robert Evans talked at an AL meeting in Wisconsin, I think in 93 or 92 or something. And I got to hear him talk and sit about 5 or 10 feet away from him. And at the time, he's a superstar in supernova searches. He had found, 20 of them, 25. Just, he had an eidetic memory, or has one, I think he's still alive. And he just memorized these star patterns of these hundreds and hundreds of galaxies. And he would just pop, there was no computer, no drive. He'd just go boom, boom, boom. He'd look at him for a few seconds, and then he'd know, well, there's nothing new there. There's nothing. Well, I don't have an eidetic memory. I have the supernova search charts from the 80s somewhere in my books. And I did that a little bit for a while in the 80s or early 90s. And then, computerized search programs started to come up, and they, by the 90s, the middle of the 90s, or certainly the later 90s, they superseded anything that the amateurs could do. So he actually gave it up too. So that was something that we did a long time ago. come across a few supernova that I thought might be new. And I used to get all excited and go to the website or the astronomical telegrams or and of course somebody had always seen it before me. In 2014 there was a bright supernova in M82, and I was doing something and I looked at M82 and I go, whoa, and I quick went inside, and of course somebody had found it 2 days earlier. I was close, but that's no cigar. And that one was interesting because there's so much dust in M82 that it's looking at the sun through the atmosphere. The supernova was orangey red, not because of its intrinsic color, but because of the dust that the light was coming through. And it was very interesting that way. So I don't do that anymore. I haven't done it for a few decades, actually.
And then Peter Miller has a question. What are your thoughts about bino viewers for scopes?
Well, I have a set of bino viewers, and I really haven't used them. I've had them for many years. And the reason that I tell myself that I haven't used them is because, it splits the light into two parts. So you're getting less light with each eye. Now, if you're looking at something big and bright, where it doesn't matter, then I think they would be really good. You have to have a matched set of eyepieces, of course. But if you're looking for something really faint, then a reduction in a quarter of a magnitude or a third of a magnitude would significantly affect my ability to find something. So I haven't used them, but now that I'm retired and I might be looking at brighter things more of the time, I can see myself using them more often.
That's what we have for questions. Mark Peterson threw a comment out that O'Meara used supplemental oxygen on Mauna Kea to be the first to visually view Halley's Comet.
Well, I'm familiar with that situation. It was a 24-inch telescope. He's at 14,400 feet, so there's very little atmosphere. But like I said, supplemental oxygen, if your oxygen saturation is 98 or 9%, getting it up 1% I don't think it's going to help that much. I mean, that's just a medical kind of perspective. I've seen with my 32-inch from Okie-Tex Star Party, I saw a brown dwarf that's 20.88. And I showed it to 2 or 3 other people that morning. So I'm not sure that supplemental oxygen is necessary. I think that's kind of a little bit of a gimmick. Unless you have a problem with your oxygen, if you have lung disease, then yeah, that might help.
So that's what we have so far for questions and comments.
Okay. Well, I'll just keep going then. So this is on the left. This is one of my favorite books. Use it all the time. And then on the right are the 4 volumes of the Night Sky Observer's Guide, the autumn, winter, spring and summer, southern, and the Milky Way. And they're coming back since Wilman Bell went out of business a year ago. They've been out of print or out of availability, if you will. But now, as I understand, I ordered something from the American Astronomical Society, and then Sky and Telescope is working, and they also bought Sky and Telescope, merged with Sky and Telescope last summer. So the 2 of them are offering, Sky Publishing, I think, is offering a lot of the titles that Wilman Bell had, which are fabulous titles. And there's new ones coming out too. I just got the 8th volume of the Annals of Astronomy. Jeff Knipe is a friend I know, and I've contributed a few things to that book. So yeah, those are really great resources. So again, this is simple, but all of these things are very important. The clean optics, I had not used my 25-inch telescope in about 12 or 13 years after I got my 32-inch. I have a 15 as well, so I just didn't use a 25. So I hadn't cleaned it, and I looked at it, and the mirror is face up in the little box. And I thought, oh geez, it's 34 years old. It hasn't been cleaned in 12 years. So I tilted it, and then I sprayed it to get all the dust off. It was still look kind of bad. I washed it once, with detergent soap, being very careful to drag a sponge over it without rubbing too much. And it got a little better. And I go, oh, that doesn't look so good. So at the edge, I just took my finger and I rubbed a little bit and go, hey, it comes off if you rub. So then I sprayed it and cleaned it. And Then I rubbed really hard because if I was going to have to recode it, it didn't matter. And it looks like new. There's a 34-year-old mirror that looks like new. And that's the one I took down to Okie-Tex. It's so much easier to transport than the 32. So clean, and then collimated optics. There are laser collimators and there's different kinds of tools you can use, but learn how to collimate your reflector if you have a reflector. And then I don't know anything really about Schmidt-Cassegrains. They have to be collimated, but unless you bump them, they usually should hold their collimation a long time. The darkest skies possible. I've got neighbors, my neighbors all know, although I have somebody new moving in. I have to go gently. I usually invite them over to look at something through the telescope, so I could show them what's going on so that they won't have their light on all night. Rather than just asking them not to do it, I say, come on over and I'll show you some stuff. And that works great. Most of my neighbors are very respectful about not having their lights on at night. If you go to a star party, there are different kinds of star parties, but ones that are really dark, Nebraska, Okie-Tex, Texas, some other ones. It's a long way to go and it's a lot of preparation, but like I said, I've done that 30 times and it's just, you can't believe it if you've never really experienced a dark sky sight. It's a whole nother world of astronomy down there. Stray light, things at the end of your tube or different ways. Of course, most telescopes have shrouds now around the poles. I have the charts, like I said, up near the eyepiece, that very, very efficient. And I have it all in order of right ascension for the different times of the year, so that's helpful. To have an observing partner, somebody you can bounce things off of. At star parties, that's easy to do. I do most of my observing alone, but once in a while I have somebody over. This concept, sort of overused idea of 10,000 hours, but there's definitely a curve where you go up sort of fast, and then after a while, it'll slow down how you're improving. But if you keep at it, I bet, I started in 1985, but I really got serious probably in 1992 or 93, something like that. And then some things triggered me and people, and like hearing Halton Arp talk and Robert Williams of the Space Telescope Science Institute talk. Just triggered and spurred my interest to go out and really push myself. And, it was probably certainly 10, maybe even 15 years that I thought that things were improving. Now, I'm also 65 years old, so at certain age, the eyes don't just keep getting better. But still, I'm pretty happy with how things are right now. And it's not just your age, but it's the training to see something. When Stephen O'Meara, who is a very renowned observer, wrote his book on the Messier objects, he spent 9 hours on each one, 3 hours, 3 times each, and with a 4-inch telescope. And if you look and see what he drew, you can't believe it. But you see a little bit here and a little bit there and a little bit, and you just add this. It's almost like long-term exposures for imagers. You just build up an image more and more as you see because of the seeing. It's not perfect transparency or perfect seeing, so you have to just wait for little moments. If you guys don't know about seeing in transparency, very simple explanation is if you look over a campfire, the seeing is very bad because the air is turbulent. And transparency is the difference between sitting in a fog, looking up at 1 or 2 stars, and being at the top of a mountain where there's almost no atmosphere above you. So they're different and they work together. So if you ever get a time when there's both really good seeing and very good transparency, those really are magical. And they can change from really moment to moment. I had one observation, remember down at the Texas Star Party where 3 of us looked at this weird object called Gomez's hamburger, and probably 30 or 40 seconds apart from each other. I saw it was perfectly shaped and was beautiful. The next guy saw it was kind of blurry, and the third guy said, I can hardly see it at all. It's a fuzzball. So things can change rapidly, so you got to be a little careful about that. I have a list of challenge objects like the brown dwarfs and the gravitational lenses and the high redshift quasars. that I keep for special occasions. And like I said, it took me a long time to see those things. But when you get really good seeing, like I had 2007, I remember the night clearly. It was so perfect over my house. I had a 2.5 millimeter eyepiece with a 2 times Barlow or something. It was like 1600 and some power, and I've never done that since. But I was looking for something called the Black Widow pulsar, and I didn't see it because it was 20th magnitude, like a 1 or 2 seconds apart. But I got very close to seeing it, and that kind of stuff. If you bring out your challenge objects, you can get rewarded. Recording your observations. Now, there's different ways to do this, and some people are really good at drawing. Like a Jerry Jones, who's going to talk next time, said he draws almost everything now. And you see more when you draw. It takes a lot longer, but you come getter at it and you become a better observer by drawing. A number of the Astronomical League programs now require people to make drawings. Some of the moon ones, the binary star ones, the dark nebula ones, there's a sketching one. So, and then to compare later, if you look at something over months and years, you'll notice that you're seeing more as you study it. In 1985, when I started, if I had drawn the Crab Nebula and I drew it now, I could have proven that it is expanding. So weird stuff like that. You can do it with photography, but I think doing it visually would be even more fun. You can follow double stars and then variable stars. And then, of course, we've realized over the last few decades that quasars are variable because the amount of material that's being ingested by the black hole at the center is not steady amount. It changes over time. And then the observations, I've always done them verbally because I didn't want to waste time. If you think about it, I didn't want to waste time at the eyepiece when I could be seeing more things in the dark. Well, now being retired, of course, I have more time, and who knows how that'll go. But the downside is I have many microcassette tapes that need transcribing.
David, there's a question from Ron Schmidt.
Yeah, go ahead.
Do you have benchmark objects that help you determine seeing and transparency for a night session?
You know, that's also a really good question. Most people use Ursa Minor because it's up all the time. And they say, well, Polaris, you know, is a certain magnitude. And then the 2 stars on the end of the dipper are the next brightest. And then the certain ones in the middle. So you can kind of tell, you know, go down the line and tell how faint you can see. Plus, it's always up in the sky, so you don't have to worry too much about the altitude. You get a sense for this after you do it for a while. Yeah, I almost instinctively, when I go outside from a restaurant or go outside from my house, take my dog out at night, I'll look up in the sky and I can tell within 1 or 2 seconds, you know, within a very close estimate of how good it is. Of course, when the stars are twinkling 40 or 50 degrees above the horizon, it's kind of pretty, but you don't really want to take your telescope out. And when the stars are not twinkling 10 degrees above the horizon, you better go back and get out there. Another trick I use, if people wear glasses, I'm nearsighted. If I take my glasses off, of course, all the stars get defocused and look bigger. And it's easier to see a twinkling star when it's bigger. So I just take my glasses off and I can also get a really good estimate of how the sky is, the atmosphere.
And then Brandon Hamill has another question. Are there steps he takes to address thermal issues in his optical path?
Okay, thermal issues in the optical path. Okay, so I assume you mean, is everything cooled down?
Yeah, I think
at the same time, I would interpret that as being cooled down. And I guess, you know, that's a very important thing to address mainly with the telescope mirror. The secondary mirror and all the rest of the telescope cools down very quickly. It's the thermal inertia of the primary mirror. My 2 big telescopes have 2-inch mirrors, and so, you know, they take a while to cool down. I've seen graphs of this and the number of fans you can put on it, and, you know, the truth is that it's going to take 20 to 30 minutes to cool down, you know, 60 to 70% of the way toward where it'll get. It depends also on how fast the night is cooling down. If the night, you can check this on a lot of these predictive websites for weather, how fast the night cools down. If it's going from 70 to 40 over, 5 or 6 hours, it's really hard to keep up with that. If it's going from 65 to 55 all night, well, then your telescope's almost always going to be in thermal equilibrium. There are laser temperature monitors, thermometers you can point at the back of your telescope, and then it has one for the air temperature, and it can tell you how close you are. Real sophisticated people have gotten these things hooked up to the fan, so when it gets a little bit too many degrees from the air to the mirror, the fans will start blowing more, and it can get pretty complicated fast. I have to say I'm not a technologically gifted person in those regards. So I have a fan on my 32-inch, but my 25-inch doesn't. But like I said, with the right conditions, I was the first one to see galaxies in the Hubble Deep Field in 1996 with the 25-inch from Texas. So they help, but they're not mandatory.
Doug Plunkett has a comment. The Astronomical League has a really good rating system for seeing and transparency. I believe it's described in each of their programs.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I've read that. In fact, when you turn in some of your Astronomical League programs, Jerry Jones, the coordinator, wants people to say how they estimate it. And I do it a little differently. I use a 1 to 10 scale. I think they have a 1 to 6 scale. So I basically, it's the 1 to the 6 is the same, and only it's 1 to 8, or no, 1 to 7 or something. And then the 8, 9, and 10 is, you can only tell at the eyepiece, because it basically is how, what the absolute limiting magnitude would be in perfect conditions. And it's basically how many magnitudes are you away from that. I'll look at something and the night looks pretty good, and then I'll actually get the telescope out and look, and it's 2 or even 3 magnitudes from being able to see it. Stars, I can only see stars that are like 3 magnitudes, brighter, and the real faint stuff I can't see at all. So some of the estimation of how good a night it is, and this happens with experience, because you got to almost know the limiting magnitude of each of your telescopes. and then with experience, you very quickly can estimate, how close you are to the really faint stuff. So, if you're doing a Herschel 400 list or something, and you're basically describing it, but you don't have to see every detail to have it sort of be effective, then you don't have to pay a lot of attention to that. But if you're looking for something at the limit of your equipment, then that's maybe one of the most important things you can do.
Dave, isn't it true that in the Midwest with our air, we can get transparent nights, but we get very few really good nights of seeing? There's a lot of waviness in the air.
Well, I think that's a little bit of a myth, because when I go to Texas and Oklahoma, the transparency there is better because they're at 5,000 or more feet. Of course, we're at 800 feet, or at least where I'm at. But like I said, I think the seeing here is better than it is in Texas and Oklahoma. Now, the best seeing is right by the ocean, like the Winter Star Party down in the Keys, and then the real high altitude stuff, like in the Andes, they have all these Cerro Tololo and the Gemini and the Large Synoptic Telescope. They're laminar seeing because it's flowing, just straight across almost. But some of my friends, the guys who made the Night Sky Observer's Guide, Bob Keppel and Glenn Sander, lived south of Tucson in Sierra Vista. And, it's very dark there. And the winds usually go at the same direction, north and south, and they live between two little, not mountain ranges, but two areas of higher elevation. And the winds would go certain ways. But if the wind went the other way, west and east, then there'd be turbulent flow coming across it, and it would wreak havoc with it. So that's a real good question. And there's probably microenvironments involved. I live near a lake, a bunch of lakes around me. Across the street there's a lake. I live on a lake. So I have a couple of bodies of water that modify some of that for me. So I would just you know, learn a little bit about how to do it, go to different places. And, I've seen a lot of good stuff from LLCC up by McGregor, even though there are trees all around, it blocks the view at the edge, but overhead it can be very good.
Uh, Jim Beardsley asks, what precautions do, if any, do you take when bringing a telescope indoors from cold outdoors?
Well, I don't bring any indoors. I have built a shed about 12 years ago, Menard shed, 12 by 16, roll up garage door. And, I just put in a new cement and new tar, my 500-foot driveway this summer. So now everything just rolls around on wheels. I have wheelbarrow handles for my 15-inch, and then the 25 and the 32 are on casters, kind of like, they're just on wheels that you can take off or move up. So they don't go in and out of the house. They go in and out of the shed, which basically stays at the outside temperature for the most part. So
That's what we got so far.
okay. So here's a list. Like my wife doesn't, she's looked through the telescope, not so much lately, but 20, 30 years ago, she'd come out and look at the Ring Nebula and Saturn and the Veil and a few things. But now she's seen all those many times, and she's not that interested. She doesn't like cold that much or climbing up high ladders. So, but we plan trips to solar eclipses. We've seen 5 solar eclipses in China and Australia and Europe and anyway, Hawaii. And luckily we've been able to see it each time we've gone, because a lot of times you get blocked out. The lunar was the other night, like Suresh was saying. The partial solars are kind of fun. Comets. Now there's a comet. What's the comet, Suresh? It's got Leonard.
Comet Leonard.
Leonard's coming up for everybody in the next few weeks, so be sure to get out and see that. But there's always a few comets out that you can see with your telescope. MAS has the star parties, these regional star parties we talked about. I would at least go to one if you're really interested. It's worth the time and the effort. The MAS is, especially Brandon, if he's listening, has done such a wonderful job getting some speakers for our group. But there's other talks you can find on YouTube and different venues, or have great talks about, even for a few minutes about a specific subject. I'm not a telescope maker. I've ground one 8-inch mirror, but I never made a telescope out of it. I can make little things to hold the star blast, and I can do a few little things, but I'm not, at least yet, gifted in that way. But a lot of people like that. And then I discovered writing about 10 years ago. I never liked writing in school or in college. Didn't like what I wrote. I didn't think I had anything really to write about. And then I realized that I was doing things that nobody else was doing in the world, really, that I knew of. And so I sent in some stuff, and Sky and Telescope has been, nice enough to publish a few things. And Reflector has been really nice to me. And Gemini, I think I've got something coming up for Gemini now. Father Brown. So just think about writing something. People like to hear about stories. I mean, what's more interesting than what other people do and talk about? Reality astronomy. So, and sharing with people, like I found out some people just moved in across the street, and a gentleman has 4 kids. They're 11 to like 4. And he just came over to my driveway one day after he moved in and said, "Oh, we got talking." He's got a master's in the history of astronomy from the University of Minnesota, and he's right across the street from me. Well, what do you know? So it's kind of fun to do stuff like that. All right, let's see. Is that it? Yeah, that's it. That's the last slide. So I want to thank you for your time, and I'd open it up to any kind of questions. I think we'll still do the chatting one, Suresh.
Yeah. Let me ask a question here. When you go for objects that are on the fringes, I know that when I try this, I always have to come up with a process to confirm that I'm actually seeing the target. I'm thinking like a comet or a faint galaxy or even a faint quasar or something like that.
Yeah.
What are the steps that you use to actually confirm that you're seeing something for real?
Well, there's different ways that people do this, and I mean, I don't think it's bending the rules to have something that, an image like from the Palomar Observatory sky or a website or something of what you're looking at, so you know exactly where to look at. Because the thing about some of these faint things is you've got to be knowing where to look within a few seconds, arc seconds. I mean, because that's how that's just at the limit. And if you don't have it there, you won't ever see it. Now, knowing that, you have to be honest. The usual criteria for seeing something is that you've seen it 3 times. And then another criteria is to have somebody else, another observer with you. And like when I showed the brown dwarf at magnitude 20.88, I mean, it's ridiculously faint. But I don't know what it was, why we were able to see it, but it was really good conditions. And 3 of us saw it, and we were all sure that we saw it. So having another person confirm it, but seeing it 3 times is the standard. If you can see it 3 times and you're sure, then that's considered a valid observation.
Do you ever do anything like tapping the eyepiece to make sure the object moves along with the jiggle?
Tapping. Actually, I just have my hand on the end of the tube. My right hand, I'm looking, with my right hand on the end of the tube, and I can move it a little bit. And the eye is sensitive to a motion artifact, so tapping and moving the tube are equivalent, and so your eye is actually more sensitive to something that's moving than it is to something that's steady.
We do have some questions and a comment or two. Conrad commented that he has a 12 by 16 tough shed. And that's what he uses to store his scopes in that shed.
Yeah.
So looking for a shed type thing. There's something called a tough shed that might fit the bill.
Yep.
Steve Swanson mentions that on Amazon, the Night Sky Observer's Guide is $104. Any suggestions on a good cheaper one?
Well, is that all 4 volumes? I don't know. I mean, they used to be about $30 to $35 per volume.
Okay.
It was just the 1 volume.
Well, that's because it's out of print. As soon as it comes back into print, I assume the price will go back to where it was a year ago.
Was that one of the Wilman Bells?
It was. They went out of business. So since they weren't putting out any, new ones, that you just were looking for people that were trying to, make a lot of profit.
Conrad has a question for you. Do you have an interest in ever getting into imaging?
Oh, that's the dark side of astronomy. No, actually, I've taken a picture of Halley's Comet in 1985 from the Grand Canyon. I took a picture of a couple solar eclipse pictures through my phone, through the eyepiece. And I took a picture of the partial solar eclipse over my lake. I have this phone now that has 5 cameras on it, and I don't know how it does it, but it took this fabulous picture of the wavy, sun coming over the water and the little bite out of the sun over the trees just rising up. It's better than the stuff I saw in some of the magazines, but I don't know. That's about the limit of no, it's a whole nother hobby. I'm not a computer guy, and I have enough to keep me busy. I don't think so.
Great. Ron Schmidt asked, do you have a favorite observing trick that can help beginners, such as averted vision or eye patches or a hood or a dark soaking?
I didn't talk about averted vision, but for those of you who don't know what that is.
I took a ton of videos on the eclipse. Wait till you see my final. Oh, sorry.
Okay, so for those of you who don't know what averted vision is, when you look at something with the very center of the eye, that in the daytime has the highest resolution of vision, you're using the rods at night, and there are very few, if any, rods in the fovea, the center of the retina, where you have the highest daytime vision resolution. And so you have to look off to the side a little bit to see something. If you look directly at it, something very faint kind of goes away.
Scotty is asking, do you ever go out when it's windy?
Well, that's another good question. The shroud that protects from stray light and from dropping things on the mirror, I can just, it's flexible enough or stretchy enough that I can just pull it up halfway or all the way. I can take it off too. And I have to do that, especially down in Okie-Tex. I'll tell you a story. There was 2008, maybe. My friend Tim Parson and I were trying to see Eris, which is, like Pluto, only much farther out, much fainter, like 19th some magnitude. And I had the chart and I knew exactly where it was moving and da 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 da. But there was a 25 or 30 mile an hour wind, so I had to take the shroud off. But even with the shroud off, you couldn't move it or you'd lose it. So one of us would have to be at the bottom of the telescope holding this 32-inch mirror box, basically steady while the other person was moving a little at a time and the other person would hold it. And then when we transferred from one observer to the other, it was hard. And we had to actually start that process over a couple of times. Now that's the extreme amount of wind. Normally you're not going to go out if there's a big wind like that. But a 5 or 10 mile an hour wind can be sort of annoying.
Ron Schmidt asks, do you have a story of your favorite catch?
My favorite what?
Catch, like I assume he means your favorite observation.
Well, yeah, I think it probably has to be the Hubble Deep Field. We had heard Robert Williams, the head of the Space Telescope Science Institute, talk at the 1995 Star Party. And he announced basically about the Hubble Deep Field and explained about that. So I went out and I had a chart for it. And we didn't have a lot of stars around it, around the deep field is only 2 arc minutes in like size. So I made a drawing after, I don't know how many minutes, 40, 45 minutes of the area. And I said, I didn't know how faint they were. I didn't know where the stars were around them. I just put it away. And it wasn't until 2 years later, I was giving a talk to the MAS in about 1998 that I got some of this stuff out. And I looked and I thinking, oh, geez, I think I saw 2 of the galaxies in the deep field. I got a friend over here and we were looking at it and we think, yeah, that's it. So I sent an email to Robert Williams, and I got something back, the same day or the next day. He goes, well, we appreciate amateurs and we think it's nice that they look at, he totally blew me off and that's okay. But that sparked me to realize that you can do a lot of things that you didn't think you could do. I mean, you didn't realize that you could do. And that time between about 1995 and about 2010 or something was the time where I was really pushing a lot of these boundaries that I was interested in.
Well, that's all the questions that I see. Do we have any other questions out there? Anybody have any comments? This has been excellent, Dave.
Thank you. And thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm going to share if there's no other question, I'm going to share my screen there real quick.
And maybe Suresh, remind people we've got this recorded, so it'll be available online as well.
Yeah, and what do you figure, about a week or so, 3 days?
Well, yeah, Valtz is going to take care of it, and he's usually pretty quick within several days.
Okay. Yeah. The other thing I was going to leave everybody with is thank you again, Dave, for this presentation. I think it was really fun and informative. The next beginners special interest group presentation will be on Saturday, December 18th at 1 o'clock, when Dave Faulkner is going to speak about the Great Debate, which was, to me, one of the big scientific debates of the 20th century, and basically how the universe is shaped and structured and the very nature of the universe. So that's again on December 18th at 1 p.m. The talk that Dave was alluding to with Jerry Jones is in January. I believe the date on that is January 22nd, it's a Saturday, but I'll have to confirm. But again, the next one is on December 18th. So if there are no other questions, I'll leave it open for another few seconds here. Somebody's phone is ringing.
That's me.
It's all good. All right, Dave, once again, I really appreciate you doing this for us. I really enjoyed it, and hopefully you guys did too. If you have
Thank you.
If you have any follow-up questions for Dave, you can drop them into me either on the MAS forum or just email me directly on the emails I sent out for this presentation. I'll forward them to Dave and he can answer. All right, guys. Thank you again for joining. We'll see you again next month.